Hello everyone, this is my final project on the unique language of PICHI, a grammar study and review. So a quick background of PICHI. PICHI is spoken on the island of Bioko in Equatorial New Guinea. It serves as a first language to the inhabitants of Bioko, and it's the most widely spoken language of the country's capital, Malabo, next to Spanish. It's a descendant of early Creole, which is also an English lexifier Creole language, which of course PICHI is as well. What this means is that they both have word stocks heavily supplied by English, and they diverged when Spanish influence came in to Bioko, and Creole's superstraight language remained English, and PICHI's diverged into Spanish, but they also share the same TMA system, which shows their relation. And then here is a map of Bioko blown up over here, and then Bioko in reference to other countries of Africa. PICHI has a lot of relations and affiliations. It's actually surrounded by 14 other languages, but the most notable are Fang and Bube, which is pictured here on the map. It also has a lot of mutual intelligibility with Creole, Cameroon Pidgin, Nigerian Pidgin, and Ghanaian Pidgin English, which are all of the countries surrounded by it over here. And a lot of people do speak Spanish as either a first language or a second language on the island of Bioko. So PICHI in general is a heavily understudied language, but like many smaller languages dominated by a bigger language like Spanish, it was often regarded as a language of the poor by Spanish influencers. But in modern day age, it is a very popular language, and up to 70% of people use it regularly at various levels of nativization and multilingualism, meaning basically that most people learn it as a first language along with Spanish or vice versa. So the glottolog mostly confirms all of the information that Jacopo provides. PICHI is not an endangered language. It also confirms that it is an offshoot of Creole, and it's pretty much spoken everywhere except government and education, according to glottolog. Kofi Jacopo, the author of the grammar that I'm using, is an associate professor of linguistics and African studies at the University of Hong Kong. From what I've read, he doesn't appear to be a native speaker, but he is definitely passionate about it and is actually one of the only people probably within the last decade to go in depth on PICHI. Okay, so into the nitty-gritty, the consonants and vowels of PICHI. Here we will see a chart provided by Jacopo on page 19 of my grammar. You can see how similar it is to English and why it's an English lexifier. We have many of the same consonants. Two that definitely differ are over here, the kp and gb. I'm still not sure on how to pronounce that, but that's definitely not a cluster that we use. PICHI does utilize all 6 categories of consonants. There's 2 fricatives, including ch and j. Fricatives include f, v, s, r, and h. Nasals are going to include m, n, ni, and ng. 1 liquid L and 2 approximates, and all phonemes are going to be based on positional variation and voiced and voiceless, which I will continue over here. To show some consonant examples, I'll focus in here on P and B and how they are phoneme minimal pairs. So a minimal pair, as we know, are 2 words that differ in one sound but have different meanings, and we can see that pretty clearly here for words that mean plant and reside. Plant and blant, they're both plosives, but they're very distinct sounds. And then PICHI and its vowels. So in PICHI's vowels, the variation is going to be based more on height, which is how we get our vowel phoneme minimal pairs, which Jacopo takes care to note that they're closer to near minimal pairs. But there's a total of 7 vowels and 1 central low vowel, which we see right over here. And then he does note that it tends to sometimes use lexically determined vowel alternation, which we can see right here. He gives an example of the same meaning, carry or take, and the vowels will switch out just based on speaker preference, but the listeners will still understand. And then over here we can see our vowel phoneme minimal pairs, mean, moon, very, very close, but changes in the EA and the OO, and changes the meanings from there, making them phoneme minimal pairs. PICHI is going to have 2 distinctive tonemes, high and low. The syllable bears the tone, which we'll explore later in the presentation. And we can see that here in the table that he provides. The low tone of bay and bay is going to morphologically determine the meanings in these types of words. And the syllable structure and phonological processes. And then just to review very quickly, here we have our consonant phoneme minimal pairs and our vowel phonemes that we'll be exploring later. So PICHI has a relatively straightforward syllable template, which is pictured right here. So about 3 consonants can come before the nucleus, as well as a vowel before the nucleus, and usually followed by consonants. The vowel is the syllable nucleus. There isn't really any other nucleus restrictions beside this indicated in the grammar, but the basic rule is that the nucleus always has to be a vowel. Words in PICHI are also going to be mostly mono or bisyllabic, and many words have initial biconsonantal and triconsonantal words, which we can see over here, like ch and those consonants that are going to be pushed together to make one sound, like pra. And then the final consonant of a coda is usually deleted, which I will explain in later slides so that we can see examples of that. And the syllables are heavily influenced by tone and stress. As I mentioned earlier, the syllable change is always going to be noted by tone. So one example of consonant allophony in PICHI is between ch and s. It's going to optionally alternate with each other, so it just really depends on the speaker, but it will alternate in the word final position. So for example, touch can be pronounced touch, tuss, or tush, either with touch or just the C or just the schwa as well. So in general, there's not a lot of vowel allophony going on in PICHI, but one example is between the vowel e and e. They are phonemes, but speakers tend to neutralize these and collapse their phonemic status by raising it from e to e. So it kind of blends more together here, or it'll just alternate between it and no one really thinks twice about it. So for example, it'll be like lick to lick and check to check. And like I said, the speakers and listeners of PICHI just recognize it, and it's very normal for these vowels to alternate and be neutralized within the speech. So the phonological process of insertion and deletion in PICHI is motivated by the want to avoid certain clusters. So for example, PICHI has a tendency to want to break up onset clusters in which the first segment is the fricative S and the second, and it's followed by a liquid or a nasal. So we can see those examples right here. SL, SN, and SM, those are usually going to be broken up by the insertion of a vowel, I or U. So for example, sleep will become sleep, smol will become simol or sumol, and then the word for snake, snick, would become snake, and that's motivated by wanting to avoid these clusters right here. And then deletion is a lot less prevalent, but as I mentioned earlier, it will drop the final consonant in the coda to try and avoid certain clusters. So we can actually see that over here in the sentence, a desi big faya. It wants to avoid that cluster, so it'll drop the G and it'll become a desi bibi faya. And then that's also here, if you hold one moto, will drop the L in order to try and avoid a consonant cluster at all in the end of the coda. Then my personal favorite, the morphology of PICHI. It's about to get real interesting, folks. So as you recall, PICHI is an English lexifier, so it follows that it is analytic, periphrastic, and, like English, agglutinative, essentially meaning that it's not going to have a whole lot of inflection going on, which is kind of contrary to how much Spanish is an influence of PICHI. So as I stated before, it follows that PICHI would be relatively analytic and periphrastic because of its origin language, English. And then because of its super straight language, Spanish, it does have some inflection, but it's very limited in its morphology. But an example is right over here. You'll see that the verb running is added on by another word, which is compounding, which is a morphological process that PICHI does use. So in the nominal system, common nouns are not going to be inflected for number, case, or gender, but personal pronouns are going to be number and case marked depending on their lexical class. So some other examples of the nominal system, definiteness and specificity are going to be marked by the definite article D, which we can see right over here, marking the very specific of that day in that sentence. And number is going to be marked by a post-pose pluralizer den. So den is going to follow whatever it's going to be pluralizing, which we can see in teen and people in these examples. The verbal system of PICHI is characterized by the use of pre-verbal articles, so it is also morphologically simplex. It has a core and non-core system of tense, mood, aspect. I will be focusing on the core. One example of aspect is the pre-verbal particle con, which consequently is a past tense by default, which we can see in this sentence right here. Con go is went to past tense. So tense in PICHI is relative, meaning that it can manifest within complex sentences in which a subordinate clause is assigned tense in relation to the value of a main clause. That sounds like a lot, but it's relatively simple. We can see it right here. The main clause is right here in this first half, a no bin si mi grandma. Bin marks past tense, and de is the was, so the subordinate clause follows the main clause tense. Inflection can also be minimally found in specific verbs, right over here, but in general there isn't a lot of inflection, but there is some due to the Spanish influence. So one derivational process found in PICHI is going to be compounding and reduplication, which is going to be present in nouns, verbs, adjectives, and adverbs. So one example we can see over here in number 2, na in country chop, is going to be the compounding of the words country chop, meaning to local food. And then an example of reduplication is hala hala, which basically shortens it of lamenting and lamenting. Overall, my biggest takeaway from this class and what I've learned is how many languages there are like PICHI that are just super heavily understudied. As I mentioned early in the presentation, Jacopo is one of the only people that have really studied PICHI in depth like this, so I really just enjoyed learning about that. Thank you guys so much for listening.